As we embark on expanding the time tracking system in eForms to automatically produce and process overtime worksheets, a number of questions have come up that directly impact the way this functionality will work. This brief video gives a quick overview of the proposed functionality and explains the first order questions we are in need of guidance on. First, let's take a quick look at the proposed workflow modifications. The existing workflow for weekly timesheets is fairly straightforward. They are automatically generated for all employees very early in the morning on Mondays, sent to the employees for them to record their time, sent on to supervisors for review and approval, after which they are fully approved, assuming no issues are found. The first modification that we're proposing is to calculate both the total number of hours worked for the week as well as the derived overtime from that. A quick note here that we would only perform this calculation for employees who are eligible for overtime. Once the supervisor approves the timesheet, that timesheet is fully approved, but if overtime hours are found, the system would automatically copy all the relevant details into a new overtime worksheet and forward that to payroll. The areas shaded in blue represent proposed new functionality. That brings us to our first question, which has to do with the rounding rules. Are the current rounding rules correct and sufficient to provide accurate overtime calculations? Let's take a quick look at how those work. This example timesheet shows 7 hours per day, Monday through Friday, a fairly straightforward example. We can see that the total number of hours this week is merely a summation of Monday through Friday hours. This works perfectly fine because each day is exactly 7.0 hours. However, there are rounding rules in place currently that only allow for half-hour increments per day. If this employee were to expand each day by simply 15 minutes, the rounding rules would not trigger an incremental increase to 7.5 hours, nor would there be any calculation difference in the total number of hours worked that week. However, if we look at the actual hours and compare that, there's a mathematical delta that could translate to a difference in an underpayment of 1.5 hours of overtime. Looking at a very slightly different example, if we shifted the departure time by just 1 minute on each one of those days, essentially the time remains the same, yet the rounding rules kick in, allowing for a calculation resulting in a full hour of overtime overpayment. Assuming that this is not desirable, the question of whether the current rounding rules are correct and sufficient is broken down into two real sections. The first is, what fraction of an hour should we calculate to determine a day's total hours? Do we want to continue to calculate and round to half an hour? Should we move to quarter-hour increments? That brings us to our second question, which is whether our outcode conditional logic assumptions are correct. Under normal work weeks, when an employee is working every day, Monday through Friday, everything is straightforward in terms of the calculations. However, the real-world practicalities are that we have holidays, vacation time, personal time, sick days, etc. that need to be factored into this calculation. To that end, we assign a base number of hours, which is 6.5 hours during the summer, or 7 hours during the rest of the year. Then we apply conditional logic based on that outcode and hours recorded, if any. The table below illustrates the current composition of the conditional logic, which is easily modified if it needs to be tweaked. Let's look at an example here for Good Friday holiday that is marked on a holiday for that day, the April 19th, where an employee may have worked 2 hours. How do we handle that? According to our table, when an outcode for a holiday exists and the hours worked is more than 0, then the number of hours that we're going to apply towards overtime is the base number of hours plus whatever hours the employee enters. Notice that the total number of hours counting towards overtime for that week is increased by an increment of 2. So just to recap on the second question, is the conditional logic we're using in this table correct and accurate to move forward? That brings us to our third question. Is the district and location allocation requirement valid across all work groups? Well, first of all, what is the allocation requirement? As part of the proposed new functionality, an expanded section below the time recording section of the timesheet would be added. This section is to allow for the allocation of overtime hours towards locations or districts. The idea behind this is that whatever the number of hours recorded for overtime, those can be allocated budgetarily for a specific location or district. The currently proposed format allows for the allocation for up to 3 separate locations or districts. The system would require that 100% of overtime hours be allocated, whether to 1 or up to 3 different locations or districts. Otherwise, the employee would see an error indicating that they need to fix that before sending their timesheet on to the supervisor for approval. So again, question number 3 here is whether the current allocation requirement that we have built in would be valid across all work groups, understanding that not all work groups perform overtime for specific districts. That brings us to question number 4. Is the current overtime worksheet design workable for payroll? Let's take a look at that. Under the proposed functionality, upon a supervisor's approval of a timesheet, in the presence of overtime hours on that timesheet for an overtime eligible employee, the system would automatically create an overtime worksheet, carrying over all the information from the timesheet, formatting it appropriately for the overtime worksheet, and it would also contain signatures for both the employee and the supervisor, since they will have already signed off on the exact content in the timesheet. This overtime worksheet would then be forwarded on to payroll, and the question here is whether this format works for payroll, simply containing 1 week as opposed to the current 2-week format in the paper-based form. That brings us to our fifth and final question. How will overtime worksheets get to payroll? Are we going to handle them routing via email or queued for printing? Let's take a closer look at those two options. The first option would work pretty much the same way the biweekly attendance reports currently work. We would email a link to the overtime worksheet to a designated person or people at the business office in the payroll area for processing. Option number 2 would work how mileage reimbursement requests currently process. That is to queue the overtime worksheets to designated department administrators at LHRIC for printing. They would then be mailed to the business office for processing by somebody in payroll there. So just to reiterate, the fifth question is, how will overtime worksheets get to payroll so that overtime can be paid out? Thanks for your attention, and we look forward to your feedback.